Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation tonight about the Articles of Confederation. This is part two in a series about the creation of the U.S. Constitution, things leading up to that. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb. He'll be talking about some of the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation, as well as the Mount Vernon Conference and the Annapolis Convention. So before we get started, my name is Allison. I work for the St. Mary's County Library System, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight's presentation. So our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb. During the presentation, he's going to be sharing his screen. Okay. Jim, are you ready to get started?
I am. I will
Fantastic.
share screen now. So I wanted to put this up first. This is from James Madison, who took notes, and I'll be talking about him this evening quite a bit. Took notes during the Constitutional Convention, and perhaps not perhaps the most complete notes that we have, apart from the actual documentation of the proceedings, recording of the proceedings by the convention. But starts off, this is from his notes. Mr. Madison objected to one U.S. representative to every 40,000 inhabitants. This is something that had been proposed as, part of Article 1 of the Constitution as a perpetual rule. The future increase of population, if the union should be permanent, will render the number of representatives excessive. And I did the calculation. If we had one representative for every 40,000 inhabitants, we'd have a House of Representatives that would have 8,250 congressmen. Rather a large number. They ended up whittling it down to not to exceed one for every 30,000. But that's not to exceed. So they wouldn't have, you wouldn't have two for every 30,000 or three. But even so, with one to every 30,000, that would be about 11,000 congressmen. Mr. Gorham, Nathaniel Gorham from Massachusetts replies, "It is not to be supposed that the government will last so long as to produce this effect. Can it be supposed that this vast country, including the Western Territory, will 150 years hence remain one nation?" And then Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut says, "If the government should continue so long, just in case, alterations can be made in the Constitution in the manner proposed in the subsequent article." And that would be Article 19 of the Virginia Plan, which I'll talk about now, Article 5 of the Constitution. I put this up because if you look through James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention of 1787, a lot of these folks express real uh, uncertainty as to whether this whole project was going to last. Nobody had any great faith that the United States, the 13 United States, would actually survive. And I like to think of Nathaniel Gorham with his comment there. So the eternal optimist, like, will it last that long? Yeah, probably not. Okay, so let's get to the subject. So tonight I want to talk about the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation, which I spoke about last month. And I'm going to focus on the deficiencies of it. But the reality is, most of the states seem to be violating the terms of the agreement all along anyway. So it's not like the Articles of Confederation were holding up very well. They're a bit disastrous. So again, I'm an archaeologist, and most of you know me. I'm an archaeologist. I'm not a constitutional historian or historian by any means. I'm exploring the Constitution and sharing what I'm exploring with you folks. I don't pretend to be an authority other than the fact that I'm an American citizen and I grew up with this stuff. And Ray Sarnacki, who's on this call, has also been exploring it. So he's been sharing some stuff, and I'm going to show a couple of images I showed last month. So deficiencies, we have this cartoon. It's the Articles of Confederation is moving forth this vessel, the ship of state of 13 colonies, and it's being pounded by waves, which are these deficiencies. It includes a unicameral legislature operating through committees. And that's not actually quite right. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress was not actually a legislative body. It was more along the lines of NATO or the European Union, where you have ambassadors, delegations, diplomatic delegations from each of the 13 states meeting together and discussing things. They passed no laws. There was no judicial branch to the Confederation Congress. There's no judicial branch because they weren't a legislature. They didn't pass any laws, so they didn't need anybody to adjudicate. And there was no executive branch because there was nobody to actually execute the laws of Congress because the Congress passed no laws. But it was just one body divided up into committees that would take care of sort of an executive function. The states retain virtually all of their power, all of their sovereignty. Each state, regardless of the number of delegates attending the Congress, had one vote. And it didn't matter how big your population was, you had one vote. This Congress had no power to tax, regulate commerce. They couldn't, they had to rely on the states to fulfill their obligations to provide troops during the war and money during and after the war. Amendments had to be approved unanimously. Can you imagine that happening today? Anything unanimous? Amendment had to be unanimous, so all 13 states had to agree to something. And as far as I know, that never happened. Whoops. And that other image I showed last week, Ray shared with me, we've got the Articles of Confederation as sort of this barge. We've got all the 13 states there. Each of them has an oar, but then some of them, a lot of them aren't rowing at all, and the others are not rowing in unison. And it's the Confederation Congress at the tiller that's supposed to be steering this thing, and pretty much is steering it towards disaster. So that's the kind of problem we're looking at. The original founding document, not the Declaration of Independence, but that which sort of brought the states together working in some sort of unison, was pretty much a disaster from beginning to end. It got us through the war, but that's about it. Some of the drawbacks, and this is a title page from the Articles of Confederation as printed. You need a quorum of at least 9 states to even have a discussion. And a lot of states didn't always send their delegations. It costs money for one thing. And the state legislatures weren't always sure about what action they wanted their delegates to take, so they didn't send them. Any decisions reached by the Confederation Congress were not enforceable. They had really no army, no police force. There was no hammer, as they say in law. Uh, they often had conflicting regulations regarding trade. Uh, there was no way of them raising money. They didn't have the taxing authority that Congress has had under the Constitution. And this is something I'll talk about mostly next month, but they had to rely on the host state, wherever Congress was meeting, whether it be in Philadelphia or New York, they had to rely on the host state to protect Congress. And that didn't work out very well in 1783 when there was a riot in the state of Pennsylvania, basically refused to provide protection. And that had ramifications for our Constitution. So we'll start off with the Pennsylvania or Philadelphia Mutiny. Happened start on June 20th, 1783. The number of soldiers involved is somewhat in dispute, but we've got a number of soldiers coming down, I think from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, into Philadelphia, as well as local units in Philadelphia, basically demanding back pay for their service. And what they did was they pretty much locked Congress inside Independence Hall and said, we're not letting you out until we get paid. Alexander Hamilton, among a couple of others, persuaded them to, okay, unlock the doors, let us go, we'll work this out. Hamilton and a couple guys, they went upstairs, the second floor of Independence Hall, which is where the Pennsylvania State Council met, basically the governing body for the state. And they said they approached the president of the council, John Dickinson. Hey, man, can you bring in the militia and put down what is effectively a riot? And the council ended up refusing. And so Congress basically, decamped. They left under darkness. They left Philadelphia, crossed the Delaware, went to Trenton, set up shop there, and eventually moved down to Annapolis. So we have essentially two not national capitals, two capitals, let's just say. We went from Philadelphia to Trenton to Annapolis. Washington dispatched troops upon request to Philadelphia to quell this riot, which she did on June 24th. So they moved to actually eventually I think initially went to Princeton and settled down in Nassau Hall, the temporary home for Congress. But this is from the journals of the Congress. The mutinous soldiers presented themselves, drawn up in the street before the State House where Congress had assembled. The Executive Council of the state, that is the state of Pennsylvania, sitting under the same roof, was called on for the proper interposition. President Dickinson came in and explained the difficulty under actual circumstances of bringing out the militia of the place for the suppression of the mutiny. He thought that without some outrages on persons or property, people getting beaten up or killed or houses torn down, the temper of the militia could not be relied on. Basically, what he was saying, what President John Dickinson was telling Hamilton and the other congressmen was that if we call up the militia in Philadelphia, they're likely to side with the rioters. So we're not going to do that. This is from a letter from George Washington to the President of the Confederation Congress on June 24th. Dear Sir, it was not until 3 o'clock this afternoon that I had the first intimation of the famous and outrageous mutiny of a part of the Pennsylvania troops. And these are troops that are ostensibly under Washington's command, so he's probably very embarrassed about it. It was then I received Your Excellency's letter of the 21st by express, and agreeable to the request contained in it, I instantly ordered 3 complete regiments of infantry and a detachment of artillery to put in motion as soon as possible. This corps, which you will observe by the returns, is a large proportion of our whole force, will consist of upwards of 1,500 effectives. So what Washington is saying here is that he's up in Newburgh on the Hudson River, protecting that major causeway that the British tried to use before to split the colonies in two. This is in June 1783. Hostilities ended almost 2 years earlier at Yorktown, but a treaty had not yet been signed. So Washington is still at the head of his troops and would be for the next 6 months. And he's dispatching a large portion of the force he has down to Philadelphia to quell this riot. So the ramifications, and again, they did so. 1,500 regular troops showed up. These guys basically beat a hasty retreat. But the ramifications of that mutiny, first of all, we have a breakdown in military discipline. And it's Congress's fault because they didn't pay these guys. But still, a breakdown in military discipline is very important issue in the military. It's a breakdown of discipline that causes troops to scatter and break line and scatter. People die. It's the one thing the military really focuses on is discipline. And at this point, with these units of the Pennsylvania troops, discipline broke down. And the problem was money. The Treasury, starting actually in 1775, before the Declaration of Independence, basically started printing money. And these are effectively government IOUs. They're what we would now call treasury bonds. And they were printed up. They're not actually backed by anything. It's not like there's a gold reserve or anything. But they printed these things up on two sides. They're signed by hand and given numbers. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, it's in red ink. There's a registry number for this particular $3 bill, and then signatures. I don't really quite know who these guys are. Uh, but it says this bill entitles the bearer to receive three Spanish milled dollars, that is, three Spanish silver dollars, or the value thereof in gold or silver. So basically, if you showed up to Congress or whomever with one of these IOUs, you would get theoretically three Spanish dollars or their equivalent. Problem is, yeah, they issued $2 million worth of these things, and Congress didn't have $2 million in Spanish dollars or any other kind of hard currency. So even when these things were issued to the army, they really had very little value. They were devalued pretty quickly. So if you had one that's worth $3, you might find that by the time somebody's willing to take it off your hands, they're only willing to pay you $1 for it. Here's another example. This is for 1/3 of a dollar. There's some interesting symbolism on them. On the right hand, you have these rings, each representing a state interlocked around a circle, and the circle is American Congress. We are one. On the obverse side, I don't know what this is supposed to mean. There's a sundial and the sun shining down on that sundial. Fugio, which is Latin for, flight, time flies sort of thing. And it says, mind your business. I haven't explored this yet. I don't know what the hell that means. But this is the kind of paper that was issued to soldiers and others for providing materials to Congress. So this whole Philadelphia Mutiny exposed a significant weakness in the Articles of Confederation. The Congress did not control troops. They only did so during wartime, and that through their general, Washington. And at this point, we were still technically at war, but not for much longer. And the Confederation had to rely on states for funds, which were not readily forthcoming. So they couldn't compel the states to provide uh, gold or silver to pay troops. So we have this mutiny. It was put down pretty quickly, but the framers of the Constitution, 5 years later, they remembered this event. It really concerned them. And it's one of the reasons why we have a federal district, a District of Columbia, with its own militia. It's so Congress can have its own armed force that it can call up when necessary to protect it. So, yeah, eventually under the Constitution, we would have a District of Columbia, 10 square miles, as I recall. The portion on the Virginia side of the Potomac River was eventually given back to Virginia. It wasn't found necessary, but that part on the Maryland side became the District of Columbia and was basically alienated from the state of Maryland. So the next thing in our little story is the Mount Vernon Conference. And if you kind of read between the lines, it's a really interesting event. First of all, it starts out on the Potomac River, and this is a late 19th century photograph of a portion of the Potomac River on the coastal plain. You can see it's a broad river. It also has very broad, shallow, marshy areas, or did then. A lot of it's been filled in. So the middle of the river was quite navigable. The sides, the banks tended not to be. And even where the water was deep, there were often obstructions of down trees and that sort of thing. If you head up the river past what is now the District of Columbia to Great Falls, you hit that drainage divide, the break between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And that's very rocky with a rapid drop in elevation from the Piedmont down to the coastal plain. And if you've been around Great Falls, you know what it's like. It's probably great for whitewater rafting, but pretty much sucks for commerce. You can't get any kind of boat up and down that waterway. And so folks had considered the possibility of circumventing the falls by building a partial canal with locks, and the locks you need to help a vessel drop or rise in elevation. It's like a step ladder for canals. And a canal was eventually built, portion of which went around Great Falls. Other portions were what we call slack water, where they were just pulling obstructions out of the water so vessels could make it up and down the Potomac River. To do so, a company formed, an incorporated entity of which George Washington was a part. They're made up of a series of wealthy investors, I think pretty much just from Virginia and Maryland. There might have been outsiders, I don't know. Washington had just gotten back from this month-long trip to his western lands, that is, going out towards the Ohio River Valley, where he had tens of thousands of acres that were his. And he would have to go out periodically to chase squatters off his land. He couldn't sell it because nobody really wanted to buy land out there and live on it because there was no way of making a living. You couldn't produce a product and get it to market down on the coast because there was no way of managing the Potomac River, and overland travel was too expensive. The Potomac Company formed, it got acts of incorporation in both Maryland and Virginia. Back then and throughout the 19th century, I don't know about Virginia, but Maryland, if you wanted to form a corporation, you needed an act of assembly. You need a law passed that established your entity as a corporation. The founders of this country did not like corporations. They were very distrustful of them. But the Potomac Company was incorporated in both Maryland and Virginia. They did build an operating canal completed in February 1802, by which time George Washington had been dead for 2 years and 2 months. Uh, as a commercial operation, it foundered. Like many canal companies, lots of technical issues, keeping water in the canal during droughts, keeping too much water out of the canal during floods. So eventually went under and was acquired by the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company, of which most of us are familiar. So it really centers in Alexandria, a place that George Washington, as a surveyor, mapped. Remember, before he became a wealthy planter, inherited his uh, elder stepbrother's plantations. George Washington was primarily a surveyor, and he laid out what is now Alexandria and other places. But it's in Alexandria, which I have indicated on the map here. This is mid-18th century plat. We've got Alexandria here. Mount Vernon is nearby. And eventually the District of Columbia would be just upriver and on the Maryland bank. But in Alexandria, there was supposed to be a meeting of representatives from Maryland and from Virginia to discuss the river, transportation, and fishing rights. The Maryland delegates showed up early, and so George Washington invited them down to Mount Vernon and put them up, fed them, they chatted, waited till the Virginia delegates showed up, and they too were then invited from Alexandria to Mount Vernon. George Washington ended up hosting this conference between the two states. And there he is right in the middle. So we have a delegation from Maryland, which included Samuel Chase, eventually a justice of the Supreme Court, Daniel St. Thomas Jennifer, and Thomas Stone. I think all of them might have been signers of the deck. Maybe not Chase, but certainly Jennifer and Stone. And from Virginia, George Mason and Alexander Henderson, of whom I know very little. We don't even have an image of him. So he hosted them in March, end of March of 1785. And what they did was produce what they have in this meeting, they're having these negotiations, which were actually in direct violation of the Articles of Confederation. Just to review from last month, this is Article 6 from the Articles of Confederation. No two or more states shall enter into any treaty, confederation, or alliance, whatever, between them, without the consent of the United States in Congress assembled, specifying accurately the purposes for which the same is to be entered into and how long it shall continue. So these guys were having a meeting outside of the rules of outside the Articles of Confederation, basically violating the agreement, the treaty. But they got together and they negotiated navigation and fishing rights. Navigation, obviously, especially from Alexandria down to Chesapeake and the Atlantic Ocean, very important. Fishing rights were also very important. Anadromous fishes, herring mostly, coming up the Potomac River and supporting a significant fishing industry of which George Washington was a major player. They oh uh, let's put this late 18th century map in here to show you what's at issue here. So we've got the Potomac River going down into the Chesapeake Bay, and you'll see a dashed line in there which marks the boundary between Virginia and Maryland. Part of what's at issue here is that line is incorrect. As part of its original charter, Maryland essentially owns the Potomac River up to within, a few feet of the shoreline of Virginia. So it was Virginia that needed legal access, navigation rights and fishing rights to that river. Anyway, uh, at Mount Vernon, they came up with an agreement called the Mount Vernon Compact. That agreement was ratified by both the Maryland and the Virginia legislatures uh, later that year and beginning of the following year. We can only guess, or I haven't seen any transcriptions of what had happened. It was a very informal meeting, but my guess is they were really discussing the limitations, the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation. And they, it's part of that meeting that prompted the Annapolis Convention of the following year. And so they're proposing that there be a convention in Annapolis with all 13 states to discuss the limitations and how they might fix them in the Articles of Confederation. And that really is the next step in this path towards the U.S. Constitution, the Annapolis Convention. And the idea was they were supposed to get commissioners from each of the states, and they were supposed to sit down and work on the defects of the articles and remedy them. The major issue here was internal trade. It doesn't seem to have been about Congress's ability to raise money, to pay an army or anything like it. It really tended to focus on trade, commerce. It was held in Annapolis in September of 1786. Unfortunately, only the mid-Atlantic states showed up. And the mid-Atlantic states, minus, ironically, Maryland. Other states had appointed delegates, but for some reason they had not yet arrived yet, and that's the New England states, except for Connecticut and North Carolina. And Connecticut, Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia all essentially refused to send anybody. So they could not amend the articles because you need 13. You need a unanimous agreement. And they didn't have 13 attendants, they only had 5. It's ironic again that Maryland wasn't part of it because you could see this is actually a much later Sanborn Insurance Atlas, but this circle here is about where they were meeting at George Mann's Tavern, which was more than just, it was a complex of buildings. It wasn't just one building. And I think they're all gone now. None of them survive from that period. But off to the far left-hand corner, you see, this is Francis Street that comes in at an angle into what they're calling Church Street, at the time was Main Street. The State House from Maryland is just a block to your left. And they were right there, and they did not have any representation. So they were really supposed to discuss the defects that they were to remedy were those barriers that limited trade or commerce between the largely independent states under the Articles of Confederation. One of the delegations that did show up, New Jersey, that delegation was authorized by its legislature to address the whole range of issues faced under the Confederation, and the state of New Jersey was effectively saying we need to look at the entire Articles of Confederation, all 13 articles. We need to revise. We need to change this. It's not working. And it was at the Annapolis Convention that decided, okay, let us then next summer have a convention in Philadelphia in which we would address the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation. I throw this in again. This is Article 13, the last of the Articles of Confederation. Every state shall abide by the determinations of the United States in Congress assembled. And as I mentioned before, a lot of states weren't doing that. You'll notice also the United States in Congress assembled was usually how it was addressed, not the United States, not Congress, but United States in Congress assembled, that is, acting as a body, on all questions which by this confederation are submitted to them. And the articles of this confederation shall be inviolably observed by every state, and the union shall be perpetual. What does that mean? It shall be perpetual. It means it's going to last, well, forever. Nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made in any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States and be afterwards confirmed by the legislatures of every state. That is essentially ratification. So you've got in perpetuity, unanimous consent. There's no exit ramp here. There's no way of saying, yeah, we're done. Our state is leaving this treaty organization. Interestingly enough, that's the same thing we see in the United States Constitution. There is no exit ramp. If you've signed this, you're in this deal forever. Okay. So ultimately, the convention exceeded its mandate, the Constitutional Convention, because they didn't modify the Articles of Confederation. Within days of starting the convention, they threw it out entirely and started creating what we now know as the United States Constitution. These are the guys at the Annapolis Convention. Again, there are a dozen delegates, some of whom you no doubt recognize, like Hamilton. Edmund Randolph was a prominent figure. He was the governor of Virginia, if not then, soon thereafter. Tench Cox was a prominent figure in the early administrations and Treasury, I think. We've got John Dickinson, who was a prior president of the Congress, James Madison. So there's some heavy hitters here. But if you look at the states they represent, there are only 5 states. So they were handcuffed. They could not, technically, they couldn't even discuss changes to the Confederation articles. They couldn't have any, I mean, they could sit around and talk, but it's all off the record because they didn't have a quorum of 9 states. So anyway, the Annapolis Conference commissioners, they issued this report, and this is kind of a summary here. A convention of all the states shall be called to consider these matters of mutual importance, to meet in Philadelphia in May, actually the end of May, 1787. Most of us today who know anything about this region would never consider having a meeting in Philadelphia in late May because that's kind of the beginning of summer. And summers in Philadelphia aren't that different from those in Baltimore and Washington and Richmond. They're hot, they're humid, they're really quite nasty, even then. Those inadequacies are, quote, of a nature so serious as in the view of your commissioners, as of the Annapolis Convention, to render the situation of the United States delicate and critical, calling for an exertion of the united virtue and wisdom of all the members of the Confederacy. In other words, everybody show up to, quote, devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. So they're looking at some serious changes here. They want all states to be represented so they can get this thing buttoned up. The changes would empower the federal government to regulate commerce. Will enter so far into the general system of the federal government that to give it efficacy and to obviate questions and doubts concerning its precise nature and limits may require a correspondent adjustment of other parts of the federal system. So what they're saying here is that our focus is on commerce, interstate and international commerce, but making changes to those articles of the Articles of Confederation that address that would, by its nature, also affect other articles that don't necessarily deal directly with commerce. Anybody who's ever been involved in a nonprofit and trying to update bylaws, your charter, you have some sense of what this means. You want to make one little change in the document, and it prompts all kinds of other changes throughout the rest of the document, and those changes then prompt other changes. So it's a little bit of a nightmare. I can see why they threw out the articles altogether. The agreed upon changes to the Articles of Confederation would then have to be approved by the various states. And by that, they mean essentially the state legislatures for each state would have to ratify the changes. So to summarize all this, uh, there were a number of deficiencies talked about. Congress couldn't defend itself. It had to rely on states for funding, material, and military forces. It was issuing basically trash paper, uh, these continental dollars. Eventually, a lot of them were redeemed, but at a fraction of their original value, perhaps 10 cents on the dollar, maybe even less. There was a lack of a central governing body for regulating commerce. So again, these are like a bunch of delegations from 13 different nations coming together and discussing treaties, um, but not really having the legal authority to affect any kind of change. They had to rely on everybody uh, keeping their part of the bargain. Any action required unanimous vote, and that was really difficult when you had states like Georgia. No insult intended, Cindy, but uh, Georgia was a relatively new colony relative to the others. Had just transitioned from proprietary colony to a royal colony just before about the time of the French and Indian War. They didn't have all the ducks in a row. We have Rhode Island at the other end, just cantankerous, and always trying to assert its independence. And then you have all these states that were blatantly violating the terms of Articles of Confederation, including no less a personage than George Washington involved in one of these sort of extra legal affairs. So we get the Mount Vernon Conference in March 1785. It was prompted by, I think you can really follow it back to the creation of this corporation that wanted to improve navigation on the Potomac. And that led to discussions about the inadequacies of the articles, led to the Annapolis Convention the following year. The Annapolis Conference, again, you only have 5 states showing up. You needed 9 just for a quorum, never mind to actually agree upon anything. You needed unanimous consent for any changes. So in many ways, the Annapolis Conference was a bust. And it only lasted, I think, 3 days because not enough people showed up. But they did issue that report that recommended the creation of a convention the following well, let's say summer, late spring, early summer of 1787, to finally address all the issues that they had been confronting that led to a lot of economic problems. And as I'll talk about next month, actual uprisings, riots in probably every state of the 13 states. So that's what I have for now. And I am open to questions. Any questions, comments, criticisms, complaints?
Just a minor point to go along with your first slide. If you look at that first Continental $3 bill, on the seal it says Exodus in dubio est,
Yeah, I didn't point that out, did I?
which just, why would anybody take that as currency?
Yeah, well, Ray's referring to what was that on the $3 bill or the
Yeah,
seven?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it basically says, yeah, kind of like the future is in doubt. Yeah, the end is in doubt. It's a Latin phrase, and I looked at that. I was like, why'd they put that on there? It's not instill
Well,
confidence.
it's just buyer beware.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have to wonder about in God we trust too, because that's like, yeah, well, but will I get my money or the equivalent? Yeah, it's a, and I think as you read through, and I'll talk about not next month. I think the month after, I'll be talking about how we know about the Constitutional Convention, what happened there, what was said, and I'll talk about several documents that kind of lay that out. Um, but as you go through those documents, you realize that these guys did not have a lot of confidence in what they were doing. This was not a sure bet. Um, and I'm sure everybody's heard that comment, that quip that Benjamin Franklin allegedly made to a bystander as he left Independence Hall. He was like, "Do we have a republic?" And Franklin allegedly responded, "Yeah, if you can keep it," or something to that effect. There was not a lot of confidence that this would work, and for good reason. We tend to gloss over a lot of our early history, but it was a rocky road. Even George Washington, by his second term, he was the most respected man in probably North America, and his reputation was taking a hit by his second term in office. And uh, the the feud between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as they were fighting for office. The newspaper coverage was just awful. The terrible things they were saying about one another. Yeah, our early history was pretty rough.
Well,
And that was,
that's one of the things that they said was going to keep everything in check, is the ambition of politicians to be able to check, someone who wanted too much power. And so it was a constant fight, and it still is today.
yeah, that is an interesting point. They did make that point that they had this understanding of human nature.
Mhm.
And they figured anybody who's going to run for office is going to be a politician, is going to have an ego the size of the great outdoors. And in order to fulfill their needs and dreams, they would have to constrain those of others of similarly overgrown egos. And that was one of the things that would keep anybody from taking too much command. And as long as you had these competing ambitions, everybody was held more or less in check. If those competing ambitions disappear and only one emerges, that's when you get tyranny, as they would say in the 18th century.
But supposedly they're all honorable men.
Yeah, and there are a lot of interpretations of American history that get, some of them are clearly what we call materialistic. You can put in the word Marxist for that. Um, and even some that are kind of economic determinism, but not Marxist per se, where they're saying the whole reason we have this construct is a bunch of wealthy people wanted to maintain their power,
Mhm.
and that it's really about commerce and keeping elites in their positions. And I would say, and I think a lot of historians, at least probably since the 1940s, would say, and from the 19th century would say that, yeah, economic interests, your background as a wealthy person certainly colored your world and informed some of your decisions, but it's wrong, I think, to say that these folks were operating out of purely self-interest. Most of them seem to have had the interest of their constituencies at heart. They took pride in creating this country. They wanted it to survive. A lot of their perspective, though, is based on, is from the perspective of those who are, have wealth and have power. A lot of them would say, well, this is America, and, anybody who wants a farm can have a farm. We're a country of farmers, and poverty is virtually unheard of. Well, that's not true. These guys had their heads in their butts if they thought that was the case. There were poor people. There are folks who you might be able to afford land, but you couldn't afford the tools, the livestock, the seed, etc., and a living for your household for at least a year until your first harvest. There were poor people. And when you find these folks saying things like that, that's an indicator that they were looking at the world through their own particular perspective, didn't have the benefit of, agencies of a federal government collecting statistics on labor and inflation and stuff like that. It was their impression. And those impressions colored the documents they created. From Cindy to let them eat cake. Yeah, that's what I say at the assisted living facility, people, I don't want to eat dinner. I don't want to, oh, cake. They'll all eat dessert. They may not eat their meals, but they'll eat dessert. So, yeah, I don't think it wasn't even in revolutionary France. It wasn't that cold-hearted, I think, for the most part. But these folks are working with by and large, good intentions. It's just that they come from a particular stratum of society that wasn't representative of the entire society. And as we'll see in a future talk, the ratification of the Constitution initially was in the hands of virtually all free men. Most property was, usually afterwards, in order to vote, you had to have a certain amount of property. Most of those property limitations were lifted by the various states. So virtually anybody who wanted to vote, any male who wanted to vote, free male, could vote on delegates to their state's constitutional convention. And it's those representatives in convention that ended up ratifying the Constitution. But there was initially a we the people. Sorry, women, you weren't part of it, and slaves certainly weren't part of it. And I would bet even those free Africans probably, well, I don't know, probably didn't vote, but who knows? It's an interesting story for those of you who've seen the movie An American President with Michael Douglas and Annette Bening. There's this, it must be from the 1980s. There's this scene where Michael Douglas, playing the President of the United States, walks into the room of his daughter. She must be about 12 years old. And he's got his high school civics textbook in hand, and he's giving it to her as a gift. And he's saying, read this. It's great stuff. You'll love it. And the kid has a skeptical look on her face. Like, yeah, right, Pop. What a dork. But it really is fascinating when you read this stuff. And I'm going to share some publications next month, some titles that you can easily get. And there's a couple of books that are really page turners about this whole thing. So anyway, that's all I've got to say. Unless there are any other questions or comments.
Can you give us some advance warning about what some of those books might be in case we want to read up ahead of time?
I'd have to run into the room to get one. Well, first of all,
Send it an email.
I could do that. There is you can readily find James Madison's notes on the Constitution. He was throughout most of the convention, he was assiduous about taking notes. And of course, what he would say, I mean, he reports this in the third person, but what he would say is then tends to be treated at somewhat greater length. But that's the major source apart from the actual proceedings, which were kept secret. And Madison's uh, private notes weren't published, I think, till 1821. The second most prolific writer, again, who's you can get Robert Yates. He was from the New York delegation. He kept notes as well, and his were published also around the 1820s. But he's one of the delegate. The New York delegation left in mid-July. They left the convention. They were disgusted. They went back to New York. Um, and so we only have his notes for the first, 40 days or so of the convention. And then there's Luther Martin from Maryland. He was our attorney general at the time. He was a delegate. And he reported out to the state legislature in a speech when he got back on what he thought was going on. But most historians think his view is too colored to be of any real value. It's too much of an ideologue. But there's some great secondary sources. I'm reading one now. It's 500 pages long, but like I said, it's a page turner. It really is fascinating, his analysis of the Constitution. So I will try to share those next time.
There's one that I read that's a sort of a chronological view of it called Miracle at Philadelphia. It was the story of the convention, and it was written by Catherine
Drinker Bowen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. That gives you a good overview, and then you can jump into things like the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers and things like that as well.
Yeah, that's actually, I left that out. There are the Federalist papers, which most of us have heard of, but there are also the Anti-Federalist papers, and these are collected newspaper articles. And the Federalist papers were really geared, there were articles in newspaper, 85 of them, trying to convince New York to ratify the Constitution. New York was critical, as in the war, it was in that hinge between the South and the New England states. And initially, it didn't look like New York would ratify.
Yeah.
They did ratify, but like 3 votes. It was as close as you could get.
And that only because 9 had already voted for it, I think, wasn't it?
I don't remember the details of it. Yeah. But all this hinges, and the other states, a lot of the votes, their delegation, their conventions in each state, and you've got, anywhere from, I don't know, 60 to maybe 200 or 300 delegates in each one of these states voting on this. And most of them were pretty close. Most of them carried by 55%, which today, by today's standards, would be a landslide. But 55 to 45, you got 45% of the people who are going to be governed by this thing saying no. I would think 80-20, 90-10, those would be the kind of percentages we're looking at. But 55-45 is pretty damn close for such a big deal.
It's fascinating too, as you read through the arguments. We're still arguing about a lot of that today.
Yeah, hasn't changed.
What about the Maryland? What about the Maryland conference? Is there a good read on Maryland conference?
I haven't looked for one. I imagine there is. The debates were recorded.
All right.
Recorded in the sense that somebody was writing notes and there were procedures and everything. But I haven't actually looked for that. But yeah, I mean, you could look state by state and look at the kinds of issues they were looking at. It brings up issues like, ultimately wind up in the Constitution, the Second Amendment, particularly. What was that all about? And you can read about what these folks are really thinking. And I probably in lecture number 5, I want to talk about that because there's some really interesting interpretive aspects that really show up really well when you look at the Second Amendment, but apply to the entire Constitution and how it's interpreted. So this is fascinating stuff. I encourage everybody to read, There's lots of stuff out there. You get a lot of stuff online. You can get the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention online in 3 volumes. You can download them as PDFs. I've only skipped through them a little bit. I haven't sat down and read them in earnest. I find Madison's documentation of the debates more interesting because it's less bureaucratic, less kind of rigid, more kind of what people are really trying to say, the tenor of what they're trying to say, rather than bureaucratic details, how many people voted, etc.
Jim, we do have
And
a question in the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
mm,
And it says, looking ahead, how were all states convinced to attend the Constitutional Convention since only 5 attended the Annapolis Convention?
that's an interesting question. I mean, I can't speak to that specifically. I can say that ultimately, with the Constitution, it required a threshold of only 9 states. If 9 states agreed, if 9 states ratified, we'd have a constitution and it would only apply to those 9 states. But that would leave the other states isolated. And in the final constitution, the various ratifications, Rhode Island was way at the end of the line. In on April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. He was the president of 11 states. 2 had not ratified. Rhode Island was the last. And Rhode Island, this little tiny state in amongst all these other states probably saw the writing on the wall and figured, we got to go with this. We don't have a choice. But I think all 13 states had, they had skin in the game. They needed the Articles of Confederation to be revised. And I suppose, if anything, that's what brought delegations from most of the states. Rhode Island never showed up. New York walked out. New Hampshire showed up late. I mean, it wasn't just 13 delegations showing up on May 25th and 1787 and sitting down and talking. I think it was several days into the conference before they even had a quorum. Anyway, lots more stuff to cover. I realize there's a lot of text and some of it seems a bit arcane, but for me, this is part of understanding what our Constitution is and leads to some larger questions, one of which I would like answered, and that is does the American Constitution simply comprise of the U.S. Constitution, that document? Is that our Constitution and nothing else? Is there more to our Constitution than that single document from 1787 and its amendments? And I think that's an interesting question because when folks are constantly saying, well, that's not normal, that's unusual, that's not the tradition, are those norms, are those traditions effectively part of our Constitution as they are in the British system? The first British Constitution, if you can call it, that was Magna Carta. But the British Constitution, it does not begin and end with Magna Carta. It's this accretion of other documents and laws and customs and institutions and all of that. Isn't ours the same way? That's a question I would like answered. Unfortunately, I'm not competent to do so.
All right, well, it's 8:01, so we can go ahead and get wrapped up. And thank you once again for being here tonight.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. It's good to see those faces.